Hello, Civil Services aspirants. Today I want to discuss with you three specific topics of great relevance to you. The first is, why does the UPSC CSE mains, the ethics paper, seem so difficult to grasp, comprehend, and respond to? What makes it so mysterious, enigmatic, complex, philosophical, abstract, and even counterintuitive? The second thing I want to discuss with you is this question that comes up so frequently: what is the best way of answering? And don't be shocked by my answer, it will come subsequently. The third thing I want to discuss is how many examples should I include in my answer? Again, you would be shocked. Regarding responding to my first point, that why is this ethics paper so mysterious, enigmatic, abstract, philosophical, counterintuitive, I would give you two specific exercises for thinking. But I would like to answer the second and third points first. The second point was how to best write an answer. I am sorry, but there is only the best way of thinking. And when I say thinking, it's an understatement because we want to know the context of every question that is asked. We want to recognize those nuances, those peculiarities, the finer details of a situation before we even attempt to answer it. We don't want to see ethics in isolation, the various topics of the ethics, integrity, and the aptitude paper in isolation, but we want to have a comprehensive view of it. So rather than asking what's the best way to answer it, okay, what's the best way to structure your questions, I think you should be asking what is the better way of thinking with multiple perspectives, keeping in mind multiple stakeholders, looking at what are the right actions, principles behind right actions, and what are the consequences that are likely to follow. And there are so many other details that I will answer in this video a little later. Every quality answer, like a building, it always has a foundation. Then you build on top of the foundation. Exactly in the same way, every question you will have to consider carefully the definitions, the concepts, the ethical frameworks, the philosophies, the theories. Once you are thinking at this level, once you know all of this, then you go to the next level of thinking about integrating various aspects of that which are relevant to the question that has been asked. Once you've done that, and remember my words, you cannot do this interlinkage or come out with any kind of wisdom on the spot, but you'll have to train your mind to actually be recognizing all these nuances right in the beginning. The day you appear for the exam, your mind should be well trained to grasp the intangibles, the nuances of the situation. Point number three was regarding examples. If anybody is telling you that the examples can be substitute for a good answer, I am sorry. In my second career, since 2011, that was my second career beginning, I was a professor of ethics. Your examples cannot substitute for anything substantial that you write. If UPSC wants examples from you, they will specify it. If they want 5 examples from you, they will specify it in the question itself. Remember my words, no example can ever substitute for a quality answer. And then finally comes, if the question has specifically asked for an example, or if you truly feel that providing an appropriate example, not a similar, but something which comes very close to that, if your example can add real quality to your answer, then you're supposed to include that example. For instance, if there is a question that is looking for, let's say the keyword is Plato's allegory of the cave. If you don't write this, give any number of examples. It clearly communicates to the examiner, somebody who's assessing your answer sheet, that you're not familiar with the concept. If somewhere we need to mention, depending on the situation, that John Rawls said the original position and the veil of ignorance, then it is better you mention this. No example will substitute for this. If you want to speak about Socrates, then you better know what is an unexamined life. Now let's come to those specific thinking exercises. Before I give you that thinking exercise, the first thinking exercise, I want you to just keep Socrates in mind when he said that every day you have to examine and re examine your notions, your beliefs, your assumptions, the contradictions which are evident in your arguments, the inconsistencies and or the incompleteness of your arguments. With this background, I'm going to ask you something very simple. I'm going to give you a phrase, something that you would have heard 1,000 times, and probably you would have internalized it by now. This is a statement which says, always respect your elders. Now think about it, and perhaps in the comments you can write, what is, okay, I'll give you a hint. What is wrong with this statement? Is there anything wrong? Remember, examine the notion, examine the belief, examine the assumption you are making, point out any contradictions. Is there any inconsistency? Or, okay, let me give you a hint. Is this sentence incomplete in some manner? So I want you to respond to this. The second example, the second thinking exercise is, in our democracy, the Indian electoral system, we have a notion of FPTP, which means first past the post. That means any candidate who secures more votes than anybody else is declared the winner. So even if that person is securing only, let us say, 28% votes. Now my question is, it's a thinking exercise, remember? The percentage of national vote share by a single party, the highest ever, was 48 point maybe 1%. If you look at 2019, single party securing majority was the BJP, which secured 37.36 percentage or something. All right. Now with their alliance, I think they came close to 44 or 45% with their pre-poll alliance. Now just think about it. If I was to give you a hypothetical question, does it mean that democracy in such contexts where you have FPTP and a concept of plurality, plurality simply means it's not an absolute majority, but you get more votes than anybody else. First past the post. Okay. Do you think this is an ideal solution for a democracy or an ideal form of democracy? Or there could be a better form of democracy? Because let us assume somebody secures, let's say, 48% votes. That still means that his or her government is still not representing 52% people. So would I be right in saying that democracy in our context is likely the rule of consolidated minority over a scattered majority? Here, minority, I don't mean religion, caste, creed. I mean a lesser number of people consolidated who are together, but our lesser number of people are represented versus a scattered majority, more number of people, but who have voted for different parties or different candidates. It's a thinking exercise which should tell you that knowledge seems to be, it's a popular perception that knowledge is very valuable, but knowledge is a necessary but insufficient condition for you to reach to the right answer. I would encourage you, especially for the second example, you are free to Google to figure out the meanings of FPTP plurality. But I want an answer to the question that I asked. Is democracy in our context rule of consolidated minority over a scattered majority? So now we come to our last segment of specific challenges that students face while preparing for the ethics paper. See, at the lowest level, I keep English as a language because if you were to go through the previous year papers, you would realize that the standard of English, I mean the vocabulary, the specific words, and I don't mean any ethical terms here, just the words, okay? Their meanings, the vocabulary seems to be difficult for most of the candidates. This is the lowest level challenge. In fact, surprisingly, you will find I keep the highest level of challenge as ethics as a language. And you know why? Because ethics has its own lexicon, its own dictionary, it has its own words, terminology, it has its own phrases, peculiar sentence structures, it has its own grammar, it has its own metaphors. In fact, it has its own semantics. That means what do we mean and how do we interpret? Semantics basically means how we interpret meaning of something, and that meaning of something may not be literal. For example, if I was to say, you look like an angel, so you realize that this is not to be taken literally, but this is something which has to be taken in context. There is a nuance, finer details, and there is a figurative speech. What do we mean and how do we interpret is very peculiar for ethics and, in fact, for any philosophical paper, including your philosophical essays. So now you know how I rate the difficulty of challenges. English as a language, ethics as a language. Now, what's in between? What's in between is something that I actually call references. You may like to take down this word. When I say references, I'm using it as a tip or a trick to remember certain things I'm about to say. Okay? Every letter of references will is a tip for me to remember what is it all about. So the middle level challenges is the first R means reasoning, rationality, or logic, which should be based on evidences and facts. So what we've covered is REF, reasoning, rationality, logic, which is based on evidences and facts. Then we come to the next ER, evaluation of, rather I should say, evaluation through research. Okay, here what I mean is, whenever you come across something, you need to display curiosity. Any new sentence, which could be a moral statement, could be a non-moral statement. It could be a social, political, economic statement that comes in front of you, or somebody is expressing an opinion. Okay, coming back to the word references. The last part of it is NCES. NCES, I use it as an alert. You should always be alerted if you're not referencing credible experts or sources before you form an opinion, belief, create a notion in your mind, concept or an idea. Now let's look at it culturally. When we hit the topic of descriptive ethics, that's the time you would realize that we will put a lot of focus on the social cultural influences on an individual that really impacts not only the morality but also their ethical stand. Okay. Now, these influences are about what? Since childhood, you've been hearing a lot of statements, moral, non-moral, political, social, cultural, about other communities, about people, other religions, their customs, norms, values, behavior. You've been hearing about institutions, okay? Anything that you've been hearing about. What happens is, since childhood, we typically trust the people around us because these are the people who are actually our caregivers. So we learn to trust them. Unfortunately, we extend that trust when it even comes to forming beliefs, forming notions about something. It is in a way we start looking at the world through their eyes. Okay, that is precisely what is very dangerous. We tend to believe them without questioning. So it's a cultural fact. Now, the problem is, while these people may be elders, are they credible experts in most of the things that they have been telling us? As a result, we tend to ignore, neglect, get away from all kinds of reasoning, evidences and facts, okay, which could be as clear as the daylight. Okay, again remember, as clear as the daylight is again part of semantics. Okay, facts and evidences which are clear as daylights, if they are contrary to our opinions, if they are contrary to our existing knowledge, beliefs. So, unfortunately, what happens is most of the people display hostility, okay, and even could display violence, which could be verbal violence or even physical violence when they hear of notions which are contrary to what their own beliefs are, their own values are. Okay, and remember, their own values, our own values and beliefs may not be verified or verifiable. Okay, these may be irrational, unproven, unreal, okay, imaginary. For example, you'd find a lot of people around who believe that mythology is history. Another problem, as a professor of ethics, since 2011, I have noticed is people, especially I'm talking of the younger people do not read extensively and they do not read global level stuff. That means whatever they're reading pertains to a local context. They don't read extensively and covering global issues and global perspectives. As a result, our global outlook is absolutely dismal. It is pretty disappointing. What happens is now we start seeing things as us versus others. That means we become deeply suspicious, deeply skeptical, outright hostile, and even violent towards anybody, anything, any concept that is foreign to us, that is strange to us, that is not exactly what we believe in it. Now, this is the biggest challenge of the ethics paper because when you come across one of the philosophers that we would be reading about is Professor Frederick Hegels. So he gave a wonderful concept of thesis, okay, and antithesis. Now both of these exist together. This is one stand versus an exactly opposite stand, and he wants you to consider both these aspects in a very objective manner, avoiding your bias or prejudice towards any one of these. As a result, what he says is once you consider thesis and antithesis, it will lead to synthesis of new knowledge or resolution of inconsistencies, some incompleteness of logic. So it should lead to not only conflict resolution but a higher level logic which is superior and considers both. So anyway, we will discuss this more when we come to Professor Frederick Hegels. Okay, for example, capitalism, socialism, and then what evolves. All right. Another thing that really concerns me, because here when I'm speaking, it's not of the ethics paper, but also the philosophical essays, the essays which demand a philosophical perspective from you, and the UPSC interviews. So, whatever I'm now discussing is relevant to all three of these. Since childhood, somehow, again culturally, we unfortunately get trained to do the things, to decide for things, and do the things. The primary motivation is it should suit me, it should be, it should convenience me, it should be in my favor, it should be what I desire. As a result, now think, most of our actions and thinking gets diverted towards, influenced by what I feel on about the subject. Feel minus reasoning. What my emotions are towards it minus reasoning. What are my personal desires? What outcome do I desire minus reasoning? What are my personal preferences? What do I want to be doing? What do I want as an outcome of it minus reasoning? And perspectives. My perspective is the ultimate perspective. We typically act, the actions of a typical person are in conflict with the seven foundational values of the civil services. Sometimes I feel all the candidates who are taking the UPSC Civil Services Examination should actually be full of gratitude for the UPSC, including this paper, the ethics paper. And the reason is very clear. UPSC has not kept any secrets with itself. Once you're going through the ethics paper, you're preparing for the ethics paper, and if your journey is, say, 1 to 2 years long, UPSC allows you enough insight into the kind of candidate, the kind of person you should evolve. During the preparation phase, they want you to correct any incompleteness, any contradictions, okay, any biases that you may have. So, what they do is they completely have shared with you the final profile of the candidate that they are looking at. I would strongly recommend that you align yourself completely with the seven foundational values of civil services. Now, what are these foundational values? So, these are seven of them. The first is integrity. So, once we come to that chapter, we'll discuss every foundational value in detail. But right now, especially to beginners, I think it'll be useful for me to mention it. First is integrity. Okay, it's not in a particular order. Integrity, objectivity, which is opposite of subjectivity. Okay, I've explained it in my previous video on morality 1 and morality 2. Uh, Transparency and accountability, impartiality and non-partisanship, dedication to public service, excellence and professionalism, empathy and compassion. Give it a serious thought. If your thinking process, your decisions, and your actions conflict with the seven foundational values, you know that you need to quickly fill up those gaps. Okay? In my course, after we learn of everything, which is knowledge, I make my students go through for at least about 6 to 8 hours of thinking exercises, ultimately helping them with what is a high quality for an answer. I hope you find this video useful. In case you have questions, please put it down in the comments. The link, my website link, is there in the description. Me and my team look forward to hearing from you.